I'm going to start us off. I just want to say a word about Continuum. We are a small firm that helps organizations like DFA do advocacy. So my goal here today is to convince you that you also should be doing advocacy on a regular basis and why you shouldn't let all of the chaos dissuade you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in DC right now, just lay of the land. Then I'm going to talk about who, from my point of view, DC listens to and hears from. And then the last, I'm going to talk a little bit about why all of you should be doing advocacy with us. All right, so who knows who that gentleman is? Anybody? That is a congressman named Matt Gaetz. He is from Florida. And the reason I picked him of all the crazies is because I think that he is one of the most successful members of Congress at sowing chaos. And I firmly believe that he and his colleagues do this on purpose. It is not a dysfunction. It is very much a post-Trump era of making Congress seem dysfunctional and seem chaotic so that they can do extremely nefarious policy changes. And so my concern is that people will get turned off from, oh, it's so chaotic, it's so broken, it's so dysfunctional, and not actually pay attention to what they're doing. And today, it's a great example. So they passed a bill, it's unrelated to what we're doing, but they passed a bill through committee, Appropriations Committee, that funds the VA. And it has a set of extremely conservative policy riders, as you would expect from the House, from a Republican-controlled House, but 4 Democrats voted for it. And I think that the more we let people talk about the chaos and, oh my gosh, how silly and stupid are these members, the more they're gonna start to get things through because people aren't paying attention and engaging. So just have to give a plug for looking past the Matt Gaetz of the world and actually focusing on what they're trying to do, which can be very damaging. Also, as you're all aware, it is an election year. There's a potential for a pretty significant change in 2025. So president, obviously, but also House members, over a third of the Senate, and we could have the first ever double flip. So the Senate might go back to Republican, the House might go back to Democrat. And it's interesting because the left visual is how rarely people now split their ticket as opposed to in the past. But at the same time, we have a really split branches of government. So things are going further and further from the middle. And so just a couple of states, and I'm sure you're hearing about them all the time, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, maybe Nevada, could decide the entire election. But I mention this also because when you guys are talking to your members of Congress in an election year, they're even more focused on how is this going to play on the campaign trail, what do my constituents think of, which is actually a good thing for the purposes of our advocacy. And then I want to mention one more thing. The old school of rock that we all had in elementary school, it doesn't happen anymore. It is the rarity that a bill actually gets considered by a committee and gets a vote. Everything gets packaged together in these big legislative packages that most often happen in what's called a lame duck Congress, so at the very end of the year. And if you see, there's only 2% of the bills in last Congress that were even enacted into law. So all that to say, it's not that advocacy doesn't matter, it's just that when you're talking this week about the FDA Appropriations bill, that advocacy does matter and people are listening to you, but that bill's not gonna pass until December. So there's not a lot of immediate gratification in advocacy. Oftentimes you'll have these conversations, they'll resonate with staffers, but you won't actually see it come to pass until months and months later. Okay, so who does DC hear from? 3 major groups: donors, lobbyists, constituents. So every single day in DC, there's a fundraiser happening somewhere at a restaurant. A member of Congress is sitting down with people who are giving him or her money, and they're hearing from those donors. Now, whether or not they listen to them is up for debate, but they certainly have a seat at the table to tell them about their issues. Then there are lobbyists who are paid to go into people's offices, have official meetings, and bring things to their attention that wouldn't otherwise be there, but they are paid by major corporations and other organizations to do that lobbying. And then there's all of us, the constituents, who they actually represent. And at the end of the day, this is not true for all offices, that's actually who they are accountable to and who they're in government to represent. So they do hear from them through letters and individual meetings. So these are the 3, kind of how I think about the big 3. But what's interesting is that I tried to pull this stat for this presentation, and I found this so interesting. So since really 2011, the amount of political lobbying and spending hasn't changed that much. I thought it would have gone way, way up. So it's about within, I would say, like a billion, a couple $100 million in terms of political giving. And the number of registered lobbyists, that dip in 2024 is just like a lag in registration, but like around 12,000, a little bit more registered lobbyists. But we know that pharma and other people are influencing DC. So like, how are they doing it? So I have some theories. So there's a couple different things that they're doing, and Rachel, we were just talking about another way, but there is this extremely sophisticated PR campaign, and you might be able to speak to this too, of targeting digital ads to policymakers. So if I tell you that I want to target the staffer that works in Dick Durbin's office on an issue, I can get to what he watches on Hulu. I can geo-target his apartment. I can focus on his office in Washington, D.C., and I can pepper him with every single message that I want him to hear. Now, I don't have any evidence yet that this directly influences policymaking or decisions that are made, but it is happening, and major, major dollars are going into it. So the thing is, this is political ad spending that I'm using as kind of a proxy, this increase. The spending that people have to do the like streaming services, advertising, that's not, you don't have to report that anywhere. So these millions of dollars are getting dumped into these campaigns. And the other thing they do is they give money to patient advocacy groups. And that's not always registered as lobbying, but they give money to advocacy groups and say like, you don't have to be on this side, but we just gave you, $3 million and we want you to lobby or educate your members of Congress on how there should be better coverage for the new Alzheimer's drug. So because this is so like, it's not that they're not spending more money. It's not that they're just getting more sophisticated and more, I don't want to say sneaky, but like they're getting more creative in terms of how to influence policymakers and their staff, and both in DC and in the district. Okay, but that is all about who DC hears from, and I want to reiterate, this is an old poll, but there's newer polls that say the same thing. A doctor and a nurse, but a doctor and a nurse in congressional offices can outweigh all of those ads with one conversation, because there's such extreme trust in physicians, especially physician constituents, who are saying, here's what I'm seeing from your patients in your district, and here are the problems that I'm having, giving them the best possible treatment. And this is not going to be true in every single office, but in many offices, those conversations can actually sway policy. And they can see those ads and like take a more like a questioning view of that and say like, but I talked to a couple of physicians from my district and that's not what they said. And so it only takes one conversation, not funded by anyone, to really change that staffer's mind and give them more ability to question what they're hearing from other sources. Okay, so how can you participate? I'm sure you're all asking yourselves that. So DFA gives a lot of opportunities for advocacy through various mechanisms. And one thing that I think DFA does so well is consistency. So you guys are in DC all the time. There's opportunities to engage in advocacy all the time. There's a fly-in every quarter. There's always ways to set up virtual meetings. You can meet with your individual member. You can meet with committees. And that can happen over Zoom, or you can come to DC. We also help to coordinate with other aligned organizations. So it's not just DFA, but on the issues where we align with people, we coordinate. We do larger sign-on letters. And then you don't have to have money to brief staff, right? Like all you need is a room in the Capitol to like do a lineup just like this and say like, here's the real deal about, issue X. Like here's what we're seeing about access to reproductive health care. And staff come and that's how they learn. And if you don't do those from the perspective of unbiased physicians, then they're just not happening. So you can also do the same thing with other third parties if you want to help them learn. And then there's media, which Jeannie will talk about. There's sort of a very inside the beltway, very policy-focused media. And then there's local media. So this is a member of our FDA task force speaking to his local news station about drug shortages. And DFA had been is very active in Congress saying we have to do something about drug shortages. And he's talking about the impact on his patients on his local TV station. And that helps, the staffer for that district is watching that news or getting the clip the next morning and saying like, oh wow, the physicians in my district are really concerned about that. And it helps build some surround sound, air game as they call it. So I want to give one example. There's Reshma testifying, yay! And which she has done many times. And then above is obviously during COVID, but is one of the fly-ins that we did with DFA in one of the congressional offices. And there's a couple success stories, but I want to focus on Pasteur just for a minute because it's such an interesting example. So Pasteur is a bill that basically is a handout for pharmaceutical companies to develop new antibiotics. And until DFA got engaged, it was sort of seen as the answer to antimicrobial resistance. And there was tons of momentum behind it, a lot of people on board with it. And then once DFA and some other aligned groups start to really look at the bill and say, actually, there's some flaws in this, and we're not so sure that this is the answer to solving antimicrobial resistance, there didn't have to be a huge multi-million-dollar campaign around that. All we had to do was talk to a couple of reporters who were interested, engage with a couple offices, and all of a sudden it became a two-sided issue, and the bill lost a lot of its momentum in a good way. And so we didn't just spend $10 billion, it's literally a $10 billion bill, a $10 billion handout to create new antibiotics that wouldn't have done anything. And it didn't take tons and tons of resources to do that. It just took that individual engagement and advocacy. And you don't have to testify before Congress to make it. It's wonderful that we have someone who does, but you don't have to go to that level. You can also just meet, you can even just write a letter, send an email to your office, and it just helps to nuance the conversation around some of the issues a bit. So that's all I have.